The first cut was into silence. Elias drove the spade into the high meadow soil, a clean, shearing sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the valley. The earth, black and rich with the decay of 1,000 summers, yielded with a damp sigh. Beside him, a scruffy gray dog with eyes the color of old amber watched, head cocked. Boro, his companion since the quiet days after the funeral, offered no judgment, only presence. He sat with the patience of a stone, a furry anchor in Elias's sea of solitude. Elias was 18, and he was digging his own foundation. It was late August, the fireweed had gone to seed, casting its white fluff on the breeze, and the aspens on the far ridge were just beginning to blush yellow at the edges. He worked with a rhythm that was old and inherited, a cadence of muscle and steel learned at his father's side. Dig, lift, turn, dump. The pile of displaced earth grew steadily. He was not digging a cellar, not in the traditional sense. He was excavating a shallow, wide footprint, no more than 3 feet deep, with a long, narrow trench snaking away from it for a distance of 20 feet, ending in a deeper pit. The shape was strange, a lopsided cross scratched into the face of the meadow. It was this trench that drew the first visitor. Mr. Allister, whose land bordered his own to the west, reined in his horse at the edge of the property line. He was a man carved from the valley's own timber, weathered and knotted with 60 years of hard seasons. He pushed his hat back, his gaze taking in the boy, the dog, and the peculiar scar in the ground. "Mornin', Elias." "Mr. Allister." Elias paused, leaning on the spade. The sweat on his brow felt cool in the breeze. Allister chewed on a piece of straw, his eyes narrowed on the trench. "Peculiar-looking root cellar you're diggin'." "It's not a cellar," Elias said. His voice was quiet, unused to conversation. "It's for the flu." The older man squinted, as if the words themselves were misshapen. "The flu? For your chimney?" "Yes, sir." Alistair spat the straw out. He gestured with a work-thickened finger. "Son, your chimney goes up, through the roof, to let the smoke out. That's how a chimney works. You bury a flue like that, you'll fill your cabin with smoke inside of an hour. You'll suffocate yourself before the first frost." Elias looked at the trench, then back at the man. He had his father's journals, filled with dense script and precise, spidery drawings from the old country. He had the memory of his father's voice, explaining the physics of heat and draft, of thermal mass and radiant warmth. He had a plan. "The draft will pull." "The draft will pull straight into a wall of dirt," Alistair countered, his tone a mixture of pity and impatience. "Listen, boy, I know you've been through a hard time. Your father was a good man, but he had strange ideas. You build a proper cabin, a proper fieldstone chimney, tall. Let the wind take the smoke. It's the way it's done. This way will hold the heat," Elias stated simply. He said it not as an argument, but as a fact, like saying the sun would rise in the east. Alistair shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. He looked from the boy's stubborn face to the dog, who had not moved. "That dog's got more sense than to sleep in a smokehouse. You'll learn. We all learn. Some just choose the hardest way." He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved on, leaving Elias alone again with the silence, the digging, and the weight of his conviction. Boro shifted, laying his head on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on Elias. The work continued. The days shortened. The sun's arc flattened, and the nights arrived with a new, sharp chill that promised what was to come. Elias did not work on the cabin itself. He worked on its heart. He took his cart and 2 borrowed mules up into the high scree fields, a journey that took the better part of a day. There he quarried soapstone, not the hard granite of the valley floor, but the soft, dense rock that his father had marked on a hand-drawn map. Soapstone held heat like a miser holds gold. He split the rock with wedges and a heavy sledgehammer, the ringing blows echoing in the thin mountain air. Each piece was a struggle, a contest of leverage and will. He loaded the cart until the axles groaned, his shoulders and back screaming with a deep, liquid fire. The journey down was worse, a slow, brutal descent, wrestling the cart's weight, his boots slipping on loose stone. Boro trotted alongside, a silent gray shadow, occasionally nudging a cold, wet nose into Elias's hand as if to say, "I am here." By the time he returned to his meadow, his hands were raw, striped with bleeding cuts and deep purple bruises. He tended to them by the light of a lantern, cleaning them with cold water and wrapping them in clean rags. He did this for 2 weeks, until a mountain of pale green, faintly greasy stone sat beside his foundation. 182 blocks, each weighing between 50 and 80 pounds. He had weighed them himself. Next came the clay. He dug it from a riverbank 2 miles downstream, a specific vein of blue-gray clay that fired hard as brick. He hauled it back, bucket by agonizing bucket, mixing it in a pit with sand and water, turning it with the spade until the texture was perfect, smooth, plastic, and heavy. This was his mortar. Mrs. Gable came by then, a basket covered with a checkered cloth held in her arms. She was the valley's matriarch, a woman whose kindness was as formidable as her disapproval. She watched him setting the first course of soapstone in the main pit, laying each block with meticulous care. "Elias, child," she said, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Mr. Alistair told me about your chimney. This isn't right." "It's a heater," he corrected gently, pressing a slab of clay mortar into place. "A kachelofen." The word felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from his father's past. "It's a tomb," she said, her voice dropping. "You are building a stone box in the ground. What happens when the snows come? The real snows, 10, 12 feet deep. They'll cover that pipe of yours, and the smoke will have nowhere to go. It will come back into the house. It will poison you in your sleep." She placed the basket on a log. "I brought you a chicken pie. A boy needs a hot meal. But you need a sound roof and a safe fire more." "The vent will stay clear," he said, not looking up. "The heat will keep it open." "Heat from what? A fire that's choking itself to death?" She sighed, the sound of a woman who had seen too many young men mistake stubbornness for strength. "Your parents would want you to be safe, Elias. They wouldn't want you to follow some old-world fancy into an early grave." He finally stopped, looking at her. His face was smudged with clay, his knuckles swollen. "This is their knowledge. This is my home." Her expression softened, but the worry remained. "Please, be careful." She left the pie and walked away, her shoulders slumped. Elias watched her go, then broke off a piece of the warm crust and gave it to Boro, who took it gently from his fingers. The work was a meditation. He built the heater from the inside out. It was not a simple fireplace. It was a labyrinth. He laid the soapstone blocks to create a series of channels, a serpentine path that would force the hot gases from the firebox to travel up and down, back and forth, through nearly 40 feet of winding passage before they were allowed to exit into the flue. Every ounce of heat would be transferred to the stone mass. The journals were explicit. A single, hot fire for 2 hours in the morning would keep the stones radiating gentle, steady warmth for the next 24. It was an engine of efficiency, designed for a land of scarce wood and bitter cold. He laid the blocks with the precision of a watchmaker. The gaps were no more than a quarter-inch, filled with the clay mortar he smoothed with his fingers. It was slow, frustrating work. A misplaced block could ruin the draft. A sloppy joint could leak smoke. He often worked late into the night, the lantern casting his long shadow against the rising stone structure. Boro would sleep nearby, a warm, breathing presence in the encroaching dark. Then came the flu, the object of everyone's doubt. He lined the 20-foot trench with flat stones, creating a square channel, 18 inches by 18 inches. He laid a stone top over it, sealing the joints with more clay. Then he began to insulate it. First, a 6-inch layer of coarse gravel for drainage, then a foot of dry sand. He hauled it from the riverbank, sack by dusty sack. Finally, he carefully mounded the excavated earth back over the top, burying the entire assembly 3 feet deep, creating a long, low ridge in the meadow that ended at the deeper pit. In that pit, he built a short stone and clay chimney stack, rising only 4 feet from the pit's floor. The top of the stack was still 2 feet below the level of the surrounding meadow. It looked like a well. Mr. Thorne saw it at this stage. Thorne owned the sawmill and held the deeds to half the valley. He rode a fine black mare and dressed in clothes that seemed immune to dust. He stopped, looking down at Elias from his saddle with an air of amused contempt. "Alistair wasn't exaggerating," Thorne said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've invented a chimney for prairie dogs. What's the plan, boy? Train squirrels to carry the smoke out in little buckets?" Elias said nothing. He was fitting the iron door to the firebox, his focus absolute. "Let me give you some free advice," Thorne continued, leaning on his pommel. "Winter in this valley doesn't care about clever ideas. It's a brute. It requires brute solutions, big fires, big chimneys. I've got a stock of last year's cordwood I can sell you on credit, and my men can raise you a proper cabin in a week, a real one you'll survive in." Elias fitted the last hinge pin, testing the door. It swung smoothly. He finally looked up at Thorne. "I have a plan." Thorne laughed, a short, sharp bark. Famous last words, "Don't come to me when you're freezing in a cloud of your own smoke." He spurred his horse and galloped away. Only one person approached the project without mockery or fear. Her name was Lena. She was the blacksmith's daughter, with quiet eyes and hands that were, like his, competent and calloused. She walked over one afternoon as he was starting to raise the log walls of the cabin around the finished masonry core. The heater stood in the exact center of the small footprint, a monolithic block of pale green stone that already dominated the space. She didn't offer advice or warnings. She just watched for a while, her gaze thoughtful. Boro, who was usually wary of strangers, went to her and rested his head against her leg, a gesture of immediate trust. "Why does the flu have to be so long?" she asked. Her question was different from the others. It held genuine curiosity. Elias stopped his work, surprised. He pointed to the massive stone heater. "The smoke has to travel all through the stone to heat it up. By the time it gets to the flue, it's not hot anymore. It's just warm. If it went up a tall chimney, the cold air would cool it down the rest of the way, and it would sink. The smoke would stop flowing. The draft would die." He walked her over to the low ridge in the meadow. "This way, the earth keeps it warm all the way to the vent. The ground is an insulator. The draft never stops pulling." She knelt, touching the mound of earth. "So the ground keeps the smoke warm, and the stone keeps the house warm?" "Yes." He was struck by how simply she understood it. "My father talks about tempering steel," she said, looking up at him. "Heating it, then letting it cool slowly to make it strong. It sounds like that." "You're tempering the heat." He had never thought of it that way. "Yes," he said again, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "That's it." She smiled back, and in that moment, the profound loneliness of his work eased just for a breath. She did not stay long, but her visit was like a seam of good, strong wood in a difficult log. He finished the cabin as the first flurries of snow danced in the air. It was small, just one room. The walls were thick logs, chinked with a mixture of clay and moss. He built the roof with a low pitch, laying heavy planks and covering them with tar paper. On top of that, he laid sod, cut from his own meadow. The earth itself would be his final layer of insulation. The cabin did not soar, it hunkered. It looked less like a house and more like a part of the hill it was built on, an extension of the earth, with the great stone heater as its anchor. The day came to test it. The sky was a sheet of pewter, and the wind had a new, vicious bite. Elias split a few logs of dry pine into fine kindling. He opened the iron firebox door, the hinges silent and smooth. He laid the kindling inside, on a bed of ash left from a small curing fire he'd made weeks ago. Boro sat before the hearth, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against the floorboards. Elias struck a match. The flare of sulfur was sharp in the cold air. He touched it to the kindling. A small, hungry flame licked at the wood, then grew, catching hold. He added larger pieces, then 2 small logs of seasoned oak. He closed the heavy iron door, leaving a small vent at the bottom open. He put his hand on the stone beside the firebox. It was cold as the grave. He went outside. Boro followed. They walked to the vent at the end of the buried flue. For a long moment, nothing happened. Alistair's words, Mrs. Gable's fears, Thorne's mockery, they all crowded into his mind. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Had they been right? Was it all just a dead father's foolish dream? Then, a faint gray wisp curled from the top of the short stack. It was thin, almost invisible against the gray sky. He knelt, putting his hand over the opening. A steady, gentle current of warm, smoky air flowed out. It wasn't billowing. It was breathing. A slow, steady exhalation. The draft was pulling. It was working. He stood up, a profound sense of relief washing over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He looked at his home, a low mound of earth and wood with a warm stone heart, its breath visible 20 feet away. Boro looked from the vent to Elias, then leaned his full weight against his leg. Elias put a hand on the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "It works," he whispered to the wind. "It works." He let the fire burn hot and fast for 2 hours, just as the journals instructed. The oak roared inside the firebox. Then he closed the air vent completely, starving the fire of oxygen. The flames died, leaving a bed of glowing coals. The work of the fire was done. Now, the work of the stone began. Inside, the air was clean. There was no trace of smoke. The iron door was airtight. He placed his hand on the soapstone again. It was no longer cold. A deep, penetrating warmth was seeping into it, a latent energy slowly coming to life. It wasn't the scorching heat of a wood stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, like that of a sun-baked rock in the late afternoon. By evening, the entire 2-ton mass of the heater was a single, monolithic radiator, pouring soft, silent heat into the small cabin. The temperature inside climbed to a comfortable 70 degrees, and it stayed there. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. thick, wet flakes that clung to the trees and began to blanket the ground in white. Elias sat in a chair he had made, Boro asleep at his feet, and felt the steady, radiant warmth seep into his bones. It felt like safety. It felt like peace. The valley settled into the long sleep of winter. The snows deepened day by day, foot by foot. Elias's life found a new rhythm. Each morning he would build one fire, just one. For 2 hours the fire would roar, and for the next 24 the cabin would remain warm. His woodpile, which his neighbors had scoffed at for being too small, barely seemed to shrink. He spent his days checking his trap lines, reading his father's books by the steady light from his 2 small windows, and carving small, intricate figures of animals from scraps of wood. The skeptics watched him. They saw the single plume of smoke rising from the strange hole in the ground for a few hours each morning, and then nothing for the rest of the day. They saw him coming and going, looking no worse for wear. "It's a mild winter so far," Alistair conceded to the men at the general store. "The boy's gotten lucky. Wait until the white pines scream. Wait for a real blow. That little rabbit hole of his will drift over, and that'll be the end of it." The white pines scream was the name the old-timers gave to the blizzards that came down from the north, storms that could rage for days, dumping 10 feet of snow and packing it into drifts as hard as stone. They were the true test of any structure and any man. The scream began in the second week of January. It did not arrive with the gentle preamble of flakes. It came as a wall of white, a sudden violent assault of wind and ice. The sky, the mountains, the entire world vanished behind a swirling, shrieking vortex. The temperature plummeted, dropping 30 degrees in a single hour. The wind hit the cabin not as a gust, but as a solid force, a physical blow that made the thick log walls groan. Elias had felt it coming. The air had a dead, still quality that morning, a heavy pressure that made his ears ache. Boro had been restless, pacing and whining softly. Following the instructions in the journals, Elias built a larger, hotter fire than usual, using his driest, best-seasoned oak. He let it burn for 3 full hours until the firebox glowed a dull cherry red. He fed the stone heart of his home until it was saturated with heat. Then he sealed it up tight and settled in to wait. The snow was not like snow. It was like sand, fine and granular, driven by the hurricane-force wind. It didn't drift, it packed. It filled every crack and crevice, solidified in the lee of every obstacle. Elias watched through his small window as the world outside disappeared. The familiar shapes of the trees blurred, then vanished. The snow level climbed with terrifying speed, burying his woodpile, then the bottom of the window itself. The light in the cabin grew dim, a pale submarine gloom. But inside, it was quiet. The thick, earth-covered walls muffled the shriek of the wind to a distant, hollow moan. And it was warm. The soapstone monolith radiated its steady, silent heat, an unshakable anchor of warmth in a world gone cold and mad. Boro, who should have been terrified by the storm, was curled on the rug before the heater, fast asleep, his flank rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. Elias went to the window and scraped away the frost. He could see nothing but a solid, textured wall of white. His cabin was no longer on the meadow. It was under it. He walked over to the flue vent. He had marked its location with a tall pole. The pole was gone, buried. Mrs. Gable's fearful words echoed in his mind. "It will cover that pipe of yours. It will poison you in your sleep." He felt a flicker of fear, the first he had allowed himself. He checked the seams of the firebox door. No smoke. He sniffed the air. It was clean, smelling only of wood, leather, and dog. He took a deep breath, then another. The draft was still working. Outside, buried under 6, maybe 7 feet of snow, the residual heat traveling through the flue was just enough to melt the snow directly at the vent's opening, creating a small, invisible cavern, a breathing hole to the surface. His father had been right. He spent the first day and a half in the warm, dim quiet of his buried home. He ate salted meat and hard biscuits, drank water from his bucket. He read, he carved, he watched Boro sleep. Time seemed to slow and stretch. The world was reduced to this single, safe room. Late on the second day, he heard a sound. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, muffled banging on his door. Boro shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. "Hello?" he shouted. "Who's there?" A voice, faint and strained, came through the thick wood. "Elias, for God's sake, boy, open up!" He recognized the voice. It was Alistair. Elias unbarred the door. It wouldn't budge. A massive drift was packed against it. He put his shoulder to it and heaved. With a groaning scrape, it opened inward a few inches, and a cascade of snow poured onto the floor. Through the gap, a figure covered head to toe in ice and snow squeezed through and collapsed onto the floorboards. It was Alistair. His face was a mask of frozen slush, his beard stiff with ice. He was shivering so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. Boro, sensing the man's desperation, went and licked his frozen hand. My chimney," Alistair stammered, his words ragged. "The wind packed it with ice, filled the house with smoke. Couldn't get a fire going. We're freezing, Elias. My Mary, she's fading." Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled Alistair to his feet, sat him in his chair, and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. "How many?" "Just me and the wife." "Go back. Follow the rope you came with. Bring her here. Quickly." Alistair had tied a rope from his door to a tree, and from that tree to another, a lifeline across the 50 yards that separated their homes. He looked around the cabin, his eyes wide with disbelief. He touched the stone heater. It's warm," he breathed. "There's no fire, but it's warm, and you can breathe in here." "Go," Elias said, his voice firm. "I have a plan." Alistair nodded, his face a mixture of awe and shame. He plunged back out into the storm. 20 minutes later, he returned, half carrying his wife, Mary, who was blue with cold and barely conscious. Elias helped get her inside, wrapping her in every blanket he owned and placing her close to the warm stone. They were not the last. Word of the lifeline must have spread. An hour later, another knock came. It was the Gables with their 2 small children. Their roof had failed under the weight of the snow. They huddled together, the children's eyes wide with fear, staring at the great, warm stone. Then came Lena and her father, the blacksmith. Their workshop, built of thinner stuff, had been breached by the wind. By the morning of the 3rd day, there were 11 people in Elias's small cabin. It was crowded and smelled of wet wool and fear, but it was warm and it was safe. The stone, its heat shared now among so many bodies, was beginning to cool, but it still held a deep, life-giving warmth. The single fire he had built 3 days earlier was still keeping them alive. They shared his food, drank his water, and huddled together in the dim, quiet space, a small island of humanity under a frozen ocean of snow. No one spoke of the buried chimney. They didn't have to. They were living its success. Alistair sat near the heater, his gaze fixed on it, occasionally shaking his head in silent wonder. The storm broke on the 4th day. The wind died, and a strange, brilliant silence fell over the valley. The sun came out, blindingly bright on the new, transformed landscape. The world was a sea of white, with only the tops of the tallest trees and the peaks of a few roofs visible. Elias had to tunnel his way out through the drift at his door. When he emerged, blinking into the light, the sight was staggering. The valley was buried. His own cabin was just a gentle swelling under the snow, with the dark hole of his doorway, and, 20 feet away, the small, melted-out depression of the flue vent, still gently breathing warm air. The work of digging out began. The survivors in his cabin, rested and warm, were the first to be able to help others. Alistair, his face grim with a new humility, worked beside Elias. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. That afternoon, as they were clearing a path to the Gables' damaged home, Alistair stopped, leaning on his shovel. He looked at Elias, his eyes clear. "I was wrong, son," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of certainty, now discarded. "Everything I said, I was a fool." "You were saying what you knew," Elias replied without accusation. "No," Alistair insisted. "I was saying what I thought I knew. Your father, he knew something more, and you listened." He clapped a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "Thank you. You saved us." In the weeks that followed, the story of Elias's cabin spread through the valley. They called it the miracle of the buried chimney. Thorne, whose own grand house had suffered 2 collapsed sections of roof and a shattered window, rode over. He did not dismount, but his tone was different. There was no mockery in it now, only a grudging respect. "The boy was right," he was heard to say at the store. "Damnedest thing I've ever seen." He sent a wagon load of prime lumber to Elias's property with a note that said only, "For repairs." Elias used it to help the Gables fix their roof. People started coming to him, not for shelter anymore, but for knowledge. They brought questions, not warnings. They brought pencil and paper, not pies of pity. Elias, quiet and reserved, never lectured. He would simply unlatch the small wooden chest where he kept his father's journals. He would open them on his table, the pages filled with the elegant foreign script and the detailed drawings of the cockalophon and the subterranean flue. He would point, explain the principles of thermal mass, of insulated draft, of building with the earth instead of against it. He showed them. That spring, Alistair dug a trench next to his own house. Elias was there, showing him how to lay the stone, how to mix the clay. The next year, 2 more families rebuilt their homes around a soapstone core. The valley began to change. Tall, vulnerable fieldstone chimneys became less common. In their place, low, unobtrusive cabins hunkered into the landscape, each with a telltale gentle ridge running through the yard and a short, stone-lined vent that breathed smoke for only a few hours each morning. Years passed. The valley prospered, safer and wiser. Elias and Lena married in the quiet way that was their nature. Their life was woven into the fabric of the cabin. Their children were born there, grew up warmed by the great stone heart of the home. Elias never became a loud man, never a leader in the traditional sense. He remained a quiet source of wisdom, the man who had listened to the stone. Borrow grew old. His muzzle turned white, his amber eyes clouded over. His steps became slow and deliberate. One autumn evening, as the first chill settled in the air, he lay by the heater, which was not yet lit for the season, and rested his head on Elias's boot. He gave a deep, contented sigh, and his breathing slowed, then stopped. It was a passing as peaceful as his presence had always been. Elias buried him under a young birch tree at the edge of the meadow, overlooking the cabin. He carved a simple stone marker, Borrow. He was a good witness. Elias lived a long, full life. He saw his children grow and have children of their own. He taught his grandchildren how to read the weather, how to choose the right stone, how to respect the old knowledge. His hands, once bruised and raw, became gnarled and scarred with the wisdom of a lifetime of good work. He died in his 87th year, in his own bed, in the cabin he had built, the air still warmed by the residual heat of the morning's fire. Lena followed him 2 winters later. They were buried on the small hill beside Boro. Decades later, the cabin still stood. It was no longer a home, but a monument, maintained by the valley's historical society. The logs were silvered with age, the sod roof a thick, wild carpet of grass and flowers. School children were sometimes brought there on field trips. They would file into the single room and touch the soapstone heater, which was always cool now, and listen to the story of the Great Blizzard of '88. Outside, a small group of visitors stood by the 3 graves on the hill. The stones were covered in lichen, the carved letters softened by a century of wind and rain. They could just make out the words on the largest stone, the one belonging to the quiet boy who had dug his foundation in a silent meadow. The epitaph was simple, carved there by his children long ago, a testament to a legacy not of words, but of warmth, of safety, of a truth that had been buried in the earth. It read, "Elias Gray, he listened to the stone and taught the fire to breathe."